Good day, everyone. My name is Christine Joyce Almalyari, and my topic is the continuation of Ms. Michaela's report, which is still on the Chapter 8 Theory and Practice of Market Socialism. So, my topics are the cooperative model empirical studies, democratic socialism, the performance of market socialism, hypothesis, income distribution, economic growth, efficiency, and stability. So first is the cooperative model empirical studies. So when we say empirical studies or empirical research, it is based on experience or the observation and measurement of phenomena as directly experienced by the researchers. So in this, the pioneering work of Benjamin Ward in the late 1950s and the subsequent elaboration by Jaroslav Vanek in the late 1960s is found a large and ever-growing body of literature devoted to labor management and more specifically to produce cooperative as means of organizing production in an economy. A survey by John Bonin, Derek Jones, and Louis Puterman covers the theoretical and empirical literature on the subject in considerable detail, in which we can only highlight a few findings here. The participatory economy raises a number of empirical issues. Why does cooperation remain such a small share of economic activity? How do real-world cooperatives solve problems of shirking within the collective? And if we compare cooperative producers with their non-cooperative counterparts, can we substantiate the theoretical predictions of the model, such as restrictions on entry by high-dividend cooperatives or low responsiveness to price? In this empirical research, the issue is difficult because of the small numbers of cooperatives and the problem of matching pairs of cooperative and non-cooperative firms. Also, as noted at the start of the chapter, we cannot find real-world examples of labor-managed firms. But we have no examples of an economy in which the majority of firms operate according to labor management or cooperation. Cooperative and labor-managed firms have operated within a market economy in which they constitute a very small share. Therefore, such firms do not have to worry about setting prices because prices are set in the economy at large. There is also the question of how cooperatives finance themselves. Do they self-finance through member contributions or do they raise funds in capital markets? Intuition suggests that members will be reluctant to raise their own capital if they cannot sell their share upon exiting. Such considerations raise the issue of whether cooperatives underinvest relative to their market counterparts. This is an almost impossible question to answer empirically, but there does seem to be evidence that cooperatives are limited to self-financing in the absence of lenders sympathetic to their cause. Moving on to the next topic, which is democratic socialism. So, proponents of socialism have been reluctant to give up on its feasibility after the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. They specifically cling to socialism's perceived advantages. Specifically, market socialism's contemporary supporters argue that planned socialism fails because it was based on totalitarianism rather than democracy and that it failed to create rules for the efficient operation of state enterprises. So, a form of democratic socialism should take their place. Democratic socialism is state ownership of the means of production combined with a democratic state. Democratic socialism has been proposed in a number of variants. Pranab Bardhan and Jan Romer maintain that socialist economies in the Soviet Union and elsewhere failed because of the mistake in the way they were constituted. First, their non-competitive and non-democratic politics and their command or administrative allocation of resources and commodities. A form of competitive socialism that rejects dictatorship and command allocation could work and could prove superior. State-owned firms are not that different from large corporations in market economies, whose managers are separated from their owners. Just as market economies use incentives to ensure that managers work in the interests of the owners, So can socialist economies use similar incentives to motivate state managers? Burden and rumor reserve a key role for the state in the democratic socialist undertaking. State-owned banks can represent the state's interests as insider monitors. State banks would make sure that enterprise managers were operating the firm in society's interest and would hold them politically accountable. Although it might not be easy, society must find ways to make state-owned enterprises managed by professional managers work efficiently and in the society's interest. James Younger advocates what he terms pragmatic socialism, which is based on public ownership and the Bureau of Public Ownership to enforce upon the executives who manage the publicly owned business corporation a strong profit motivation. The objectives of the publicly owned and privately owned company would be the same. Socialist managers would be encouraged just as capitalist managers are to maximize profits. The difference, however, is that dividends from profits are distributed to society at larger than to private shareholders. In this fashion, the unequal distribution of wealth will be equalized. The social board of directors would ensure that the social dividend is dispersed in an egalitarian manner. But then, one of the most practical problems of this pragmatic socialism is how to get from the current system of private ownership to state ownership. How is the nationalization of private property to be affected, and how are private shareholders to be compensated? And also, if a great deal of coercion is required, would this be consent with the democratic ideal? The pillar of democratic socialism is its combination of state ownership with democratic government. In his 1944 The Road to Serfdom, F.A. Hayek wrote that state ownership will eventually lead to political totalitarianism. Ownership by the state will automatically lead to demands for planning and to intrusion into economic decision-making by politicians. Hayek maintained that administrative resource allocation necessarily leads to authoritarianism. Socialist economies can never be democratically organized, and the resources cannot be administratively allocated without the exercise of extreme political power. Only those with skill in exercising political power will advance in the political apparatus. So, totalitarianism is a logical consequence of the attempt to centrally plan an economy. Although there may be no original intent to exercise political power over people, the exercise of arbitrary power is the consequence of the desire to plan the economy scientifically. And furthermore, in order to achieve their end, collectivists must create power, power over men wielded by other men of a magnitude never before known, and their success will depend on the extent to which they achieve such power. Andre Schleifer and Robert Vishny make the case that, for a number of reasons, even a democratically organized market socialism will not work. First, with state ownership, state enterprises will be run to achieve political objectives, such as ensuring employment or buying the loyalty of supporters. So, if the state owners decided to use the most common economic criterion, which is the profit maximization, they would divide the country's enterprises into monopolies because monopolies yield more cumulative profits than competitive firms. Past experience with socialism shows that socialist economies have indeed been organized into monopolies and cartels. Second, Schleifer and Vishny argue that public choice decisions will be more inefficient under democratic socialism than under market democracy. Like other forms of democracy, democratic socialist government are prone to exploit the minority for the benefit of the majority or be dominated by interest groups. However, because state ownership is pervasive, these abuses will have more profound effects in socialist economies. Third, no matter how hard the democratic socialist economy attempts to avoid it, the management of state owned firms will become bureaucratized. Criteria like cost economies or technological innovation will be ignored, and the state enterprises will be run for the convenience of their bureaucratic managers. Moreover, it will be difficult to monitor bureaucratic management, even if state-owned banks are used as major shareholders in state enterprises to ensure that they are run in a business-like fashion. The state remains the ultimate owner. As such, there is no way to avoid the politicization of the running of the enterprise. This ongoing discussion sends several messages. So first, the demise of socialist economic systems in the former Soviet Union and the countries of Eastern Europe did not end discussions about socialism in general and market socialism in particular. So second, much of the discussion now focuses on the nature of the state in a socialist system and on how agency and incentives problem can be resolved if ownership is public. And finally, the promise of a more egalitarian distribution of income has had and continues to have strong emotional and political appeal. Although oil companies may have features not shared by other enterprises, it is one sector in which we can make crude efficiency comparisons. So, based on utilization of reserves, employees per barrel of production, and so on. So, in figure 8.4 shows the rankings of the world's oil producers by their measured productivity. It shows that the most efficient oil companies are private and that least efficient are state-owned. So this idea of democratic socialism is far from dead. Although conceived with idealistic intentions, the appeal of democratic socialism is subject to abuse. Throughout the world, populist politicians can reveal the greedy, rich, and their command of wealth, which should be the property of the hardworking men and women on whose back this wealth was created. And now, let's proceed to the performance of market socialism. Hypothesis. With the exception of the former Yugoslavia, a small country beset by ethnic problems that led to its demise, we lack real-world experience with market socialism, of either the range or the worker-managed type. Consequently, we do not have the advantage of long historical experience to test hypotheses concerning the economic performance of market socialism. The following paragraphs represent our best analytical, though somewhat speculative, efforts. Income distribution. The easiest hypothesis to formulate concerns the distribution of income under market socialism. Inasmuch as capital continues to belong to society, we would expect income to be distributed more nearly equally under market socialism than under capitalism. Even in the case of worker-managed enterprises, the state must be paid a fee for the use of capital, and the state would presumably divide such income among the population on a fairly equal basis. Some reservations must be expressed. However, as critics have pointed out, prosperous worker-managed firms might protect extraordinarily high earnings by excluding outsiders. This type of behavior could lead to significant inequality in wage income. Next is economic growth. Proponents of market socialism claim that market socialism would yield relatively high rates of growth, primarily because society would flow earnings from capital back into the economy. This conclusion, however, assumes that the socialist state would not be pressured into putting the social dividend into current consumption in the form of subsidies and social services. Such pressure would be particularly strong in the case of democratically elected socialist governments. For these reasons, we believe it risky to presume that market socialism will yield higher investment rates and hence higher rates of growth than the capitalist model. The outcome is far from certain. However, the theory of market socialism does not yield strong propositions concerning economic efficiency, arguing that market socialism can indeed be more efficient than capitalism. Its advocates cite the lack of monopoly, the greater attention to externalities, and individual participation in decision making. Its critics, however, mount equally convincing arguments about the inefficiency of market socialism, motivation problems, perverse supply curves, and the difficulty of finding equilibrium prices. Accordingly, we cannot venture any hypothesis about the relative efficiency of market socialism. Lastly, stability. Advocates of market socialism make the following case for greater economic stability. The state will have greater control over the investment rate, so sharp fluctuations in investment can be avoided. Counter arguments exist, however. If market socialist economies have trouble adjusting prices to equilibrium, macroeconomic instabilities associated with non equilibrium prices might be experienced. Moreover, democratically elected officials will be under strong pressure to pursue popular economic policies, while feeling less pressure from market forces to tighten the reins on economic policy. Again, we cannot propose any strong hypothesis concerning the relative stability of market socialism. That's all for my report. Thank you for listening and God bless us all.